mai, haere mai. Welcome to the Maxim Institute podcast. My name is Jason Heal. I'm the Communications Manager at Maxim Institute, and this is our weekly short-form podcast. These podcasts are released in tandem with our weekly column and are a chance for you to hear in-depth from the column's author about some of the thinking that went into producing their final piece. Today we talk to Maxim researcher Alapasita Pomelile about her recent column. Hello, welcome back to the podcast. Great to have you.
Thanks, Jason. First one for the year. Always a pleasure.
Yes, and we're talking about your recent column called The Crisis. You start by saying that reflecting on the year 2022, the word crisis comes to mind. Why is that top of mind for you?
Yeah, I'm sure you're familiar with this. Last year there were lots of things going on that were labelled as a crisis. For instance, we had issues around inflation and the cost of living earlier on in 2022, where our dear Prime Minister initially refused to label it as a crisis.
Yeah, I remember that. She's like, it's not a crisis.
Correct.
And everyone else was going, this is serious.
Yeah. Petrol prices going up, cost of living going up, except wages aren't going up.
Yeah.
And so she refused to call it anything but that.
Yeah.
And funnily enough, the next week, decided to call it a crisis, an emergency. She said, whatever the term is, we are definitely in a situation that we need to respond and put things into actions.
Okay.
So that was pretty comical.
Yes, but there was also other situations that were labelled crises as well, right?
Correct.
Yeah.
Well, I'm sure everyone saw this. Housing in particular was constant headlines or popular phrasing of our housing issues or housing crisis. Then we saw an increase in crime such as ram raids, even that's been labelled a crisis. And then we've got issues around education, like with truancy and it being at its worst rate ever for a couple of since 2013 possibly, and that being labelled a crisis.
Yeah.
So essentially everywhere you're looking.
Yeah, and I remember the health system and the state of the hospitals and the emergency department wait times and all
correct.
this.
And that's all in the background too.
Yeah.
And then I can also think of our court system. The backlog of cases being on the back pedal because of obviously pandemic disruptions. And so 2022 was almost a year of wherever you turned and whichever headline you read or saw, crisis was in front of you. So
so it was the year of crisis, but we kind of have to be, you make the point there that we have to be careful of labelling everything a crisis because when something is labelled a crisis, it threatens our liberty and democracy.
Yeah, correct.
How does it do that?
Yeah, absolutely. Certain situations warrant being called a crisis.
Yeah.
The crisis meaning something that it's at its worst point. But we've seen
so kind of it's as bad as it's going to get, and we need to do something about it.
You've only got two options when it's hit its worst point. It's either life or death. Yeah. And you've got limited choices, right? Yeah. But we saw perhaps last year and even prior to last year, over the past 3 years, when a country declared itself being in a state of emergency, labelling that a crisis, it meant that they could exercise, they had the licence to govern however they could, to take power into their hands, to pass bills with limited or minimal safeguards, with the public not knowing about it. So obviously, liberties and democracy itself is in a worrying state because no one's keeping things in check because it's a crisis. And so the assumption is that we trust the powers that be to govern well under these conditions, when actually once you give them the license or power, it's hard to peel those powers back. Yeah,
I think it's always interesting when you give someone emergency powers, how reluctant they are to give them back.
That's right. Yeah. And we saw that all throughout the West in the sense of governments not wanting to, or extending emergency bills or COVID emergency acts and extending the time frame when initially they had said it was only for this period. And so there's no way to sort of not stop it, but once you've given them an inch, right, they're going to take a mile, and so there's no take backsies as such in layman's terms. So once you open the floodgates for that sort of power grab, it's really hard to peel it back.
Yeah, and I think the phrase "the new normal" is always used to justify that. Oh, this is just the new normal once
Correct.
we've got these. Yeah, fascinating. The other point that you make is that when everything is labelled a crisis, then nothing is, and it kind of leads to apathy. Can you just expand on that for us?
Yeah, I think I was trying to highlight that there's a numbness that we start to create, or a desensitizing that happens when everything is a crisis, because in our human nature, everything gets overwhelming when it's just seen as bad things, right? And so a crisis denotes something that's really bad. And so if everything is bad, no one's going to want to react or want to be empathetic towards it, right? And so
because then you've got like 1,000 different things that
correct.
are kind of trying to vie for your attention and your empathy,
and it's overwhelming.
Yeah.
Right? And so if when you're in a state of being overwhelmed, it's hard to respond or react or move, perhaps. And so when we begin to sort of carelessly use the term crisis to, get votes or politicize it or polarize things, like the public no longer will want to care because that is just another bad day. Yeah. Right? And so...
And I guess in some ways then it becomes... the public becomes cynical because then it becomes a political tool.
Correct.
Like, they're just politicizing this thing again.
Yeah, so it's sort of hard to really see things as they are if they're being polarized, and crisis is being slapped onto everything that really, when you sort of like fine-tooth comb through things and the facts, in reality it isn't a crisis, and it's sort of how it should be used. So I think when people they tune out. They check out, they don't want to, if it's going to be bad news, why tune in? When actually, some of our social and public issues affect all of us, but because the public's probably just sick of hearing bad news all the time, they won't pay attention to the things that affect them. So
in an election year, how can we avoid this sort of crisisization, I guess, of all these issues?
I like that. I think we need to pump the brakes on labelling every problem or type of hardship as a crisis, right? We need to do better, I think, in terms of being precise with our language and clear with our language and remaining true to facts and reality. And, meaning what you write what you mean sort of essence. And
none of this PR, commsing, spin, marketing stuff,
we don't need to... A crisis is meant to put the brakes on things. Not fuel things and make them worse. And the way we've used crisis in the past year, and prior to that, even probably pre-COVID, post-COVID, it hasn't necessarily been a catalyst for action. It's been a catalyst for dividing people and countries and population groups, rather than creating things like a middle ground for solutions, right? When we're careful with our words, it's easier to listen and do better and be able to work together. So labelling everything as a crisis doesn't exactly foster community or isn't a productive way of using our time. So I think we need to do better to describe things as they are, but also pump the brakes on mishandling the use of crisis.
Awesome. Great. Ala, thanks for being on the podcast.
Thanks for having me, Jason.
And now let's hear from Ala as she reads her column.
Reflecting on 2022, the word crisis comes to mind. In particular, a TV interview where our Prime Minister noted rising living costs and inflation as anything but a crisis. Quite the contrast when the housing, economic and cost of living crises were constant media headlines. Don't forget the crisis atmosphere we already have: school truancy crisis, health system crisis, ram raids crisis, and even ideological crisis. A crisis is where a situation, problem or disease has reached its worst point. For example, in term 2 of 2022, 39.9% of students attended schools in Kura regularly. Our attendance rates are worse than other comparable countries, including Australia, even when we factor in COVID-19 disruptions. Since the Great Depression and World Wars, cultural critiques and interpretations of global events with crisis in their titles have increased. The epidemic use of the term crisis at a local, national and international level has hit crisis proportions. It has become a communication catchword. The word's metaphorical flexibility, coupled with its ability to demand action, makes it appealing. However, the danger of the word's frequent use in the public square is damaging. When a state of emergency is labelled a crisis, it threatens liberties and democracy. Actions like restricting freedoms, seizing and centralising power, and silencing critics are justified and undertaken. When we default to using the word crisis for everyday issues, it incites a tendency towards imprecision and vagueness. The word crisis finds its roots in the ancient Greek words krisis and krino, meaning judgment and a decision, and to separate, distinguish, discriminate, to judge. German historian Reinhard Koselleck describes the Greeks' use of crisis as imposing choices between binary alternatives, right or wrong, life or death, salvation or damnation. Its original use denotes a turning point, indicating the severity and urgency of a situation, a stark contrast to the term's contemporary use. Throughout 2022, the government used the term crisis as a catalyst for action, often minus the action. In the media, it is a catchphrase for raising the temperature on issues. When almost every public or difficulty is termed a crisis talk becomes a gas pedal rather than a turning point. We must be careful how we use the term to preserve the word's potency for watershed events. Avoiding the tendency to label every hardship as a crisis extends the middle ground for creating solutions. When everything is a crisis, nothing can be. The public becomes apathetic to social issues and the problems rife in our society, and we become desensitized or numb to the seriousness of the term. As we head into an election year, it's time to keep crisis talk in check, stick to the facts and be true to reality. Precise language and clarity are more necessary than ever as PR and communications gurus increasingly shape our political landscape. Let's learn from the past year's troubles and avoid careless crisis talk. May 2023 be an election year where we pump the brakes on mishandling crisis.
Thanks for listening to the Maxim Institute podcast. If you'd like to hear more from us and keep up with the rest of our research and analysis of politics and policy in New Zealand, you can sign up on the homepage of our website to get our monthly forum email and invitations to future Maxim Institute events. You can search and subscribe to us on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, or wherever you get your podcasts. From the team at Maxim, mā te wā, goodbye for now.